We all know that Jonathan was killed in action on 2 December 1950 at the Chosin Reservoir near Hangul-ri in North Korea. From 31 August to 9 November 1954, the United Nations and Communist forces represented by the Chinese and North Koreans exchanged the remains of the war dead in what came to be known as Operation Glory. And as protocol, the United Nations transferred any unknown remains suspected of being those of an American to the U.S. Army Central Identification Command unit, in Kokura, Japan, for analysis. Among those remains that were transferred up there were remains that were designated as 1900. They just put a number onto those remains. They were later designated as with an X. And X meant that they were killed in action, 14900. The scientists at the Central Identification Unit determined that those were the remains of a 20 to 22-year-old Caucasian male who stood approximately 73 to 74 inches tall. However, any attempts for them to identify the remains were unsuccessful. And so in 1955, a military review board declared the remains to be unidentifiable. And in 1956, they were interred at the National Cemetery, at the National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific, which is known as the Punch Bowl. And they were interred in Section U, grave 999. In 2012, the Central Identification Lab re-examined the Central Identification Unit records, the records from the Kokura mortuary that they were transferred to in '54. And they concluded that the possibility of identifying those remains now exists with today's technology. And records indicated that the remains were turned over on 10 September 1954 by the Chinese as part of a larger group of 25 total cases of remains that they turn over to the Americans. All of the cases that were turned over were allegedly recovered from the south and west sides of the Chosin Reservoir. Most of the Marines were killed on the west side of the Chosin Reservoir. The Army was on the eastern side. Of the 25 cases, 4 of those cases were identified as being remains as either Korean or possible Chinese. So 4 of the 25 were identified as not American remains. And of the remaining 21 cases, 15 were identified as U.S. personnel, all but 1 of whom were men lost on the south or the west sides of the Chosin Reservoir. The location where the Chinese claimed to have recovered those remains correlated to the routes that the 5th and 7th Marines took. The regiments withdrew from the Chosin Reservoir to Hangul-ri prior to their eventual evacuation. And developing an assumption of the remains were those of a Marine lost in the vicinity of the Chosin, generated by the Central Identification Unit scientists in 1954 to all Marines that were still missing, that were still unaccounted for from the south and west side of the Chosin Reservoir. The results were likely the remains of 5 Marines. So they narrowed it down to 5 Marines, Jonathan being one of them, after they compared the dental charts with the dental records of all the Marines that were unaccounted for. And on after narrowing it down, and 3 of the 5 Marines had antemortem chest X-rays, chest radiographs, chest radiographs. On 28 February 2013, the remains were exhumed for analysis.
Where are you? Okay.
Part of the analysis of examining the radiographs performed of the chest X-rays were they were looking at rings, and the comparisons were performed in the blind. They had no idea, without prior knowledge, how or why the 3 individuals were selected for comparison. All of them to have any preconceived ideas as to, or you know, influence as to who these could be. So comparisons are always done in the blind. In 1950, an antemortem radiogram, and due to the condition of the antemortem film for PFC Posey, only the clavicles were used for comparisons. And the years, the government, the military only used what we call mitochondrial DNA. Mitochondrial DNA is maternally inherited from the mother. They've done research over the years, and they've determined that mitochondrial DNA remains intact for hundreds and hundreds of years, where nuclear DNA and Y-DNA, which is nuclear DNA, is could be the kids of Marines, you know, the sons and daughters. A Y-DNA could be the sons of a brother of the Marine. So it's the DNA gets. 11th Artillery Regiment, 1st Marine Division, on 2 December 1950, when he was killed during the Battle of the Chosin Reservoir. A witness to his death reported that PFC Posey was hit in the chest by automatic weapons fire. His lost location correlates closely to the recovery location given by the Chinese for where they recovered the remains that they turned over to the Americans that were designated as X-14900. A mitochondrial DNA in this case was not an analytical option because to date no Korean unknown remains exhumed from the punch bowl have yielded viable mitochondrial DNA. When the remains were collected off the battlefield with the agreement that they coded the old service members that were during the Korean War and World War II were given chest x-rays because tuberculosis was prevalent at that time. And so part of the medical exam was a chest x-ray when you sign up to go in. According to the scientists, based on the assumption that the unknown remains were those of an American Marine lost in the Chosin Reservoir, in the purported location where the Chinese said that they recovered those remains, biological profiles that were developed on the guys. And in 2013, the Central Identification Lab, after exhuming the remains for reanalysis, the reevaluation of the skeletal remains, including the comparison of the antemortem and postmortem chest radiographs, led to the assumption that the remains that were designated X-14900 remains were the remains of PFC Jonathan Posey, to the exclusion of other reasonable candidates. And I'll get into how they narrowed it down to this Jonathan. And according to Dr. Tom Holland has several books that he has. Now we're going to get into the skeleton. We're going to get into the skeleton.
What in
so
this?
You don't want to go, it belongs to. And I forgot what they call that database that the FBI used, that they put fingerprints into. CODIS. CODIS, yeah, code, absolutely belong to. And what they did was they matched the postmortem remains that they recovered to the dental charts of the 5 guys. During the Korean War, they didn't do radiographs, dental charts, where the dentist would look in your mouth, and he would do a chart where he would chart, it looked something like this. If you saw a dot, that meant either a cavity was there or a filling had been placed there. If you saw a slash, that meant that this guy had a terrible cavity, and that the next time he come in, we're going to extract that tooth. And once they extract it, then they would put another slash to make it an X, which means that the tooth is
Completed.
missing. So you would see different little marks, and it has a chart. He was 20, about 27 months when he went missing, or something like this. In his mouth, they would have seen at the time that they took the dentist looked in his mouth. He would put an X there, which means that the tooth either the teeth had been pulled or they just hadn't come in. And you could look at the age of the Marine and you could tell that they hadn't been pulled. They more than likely hadn't erupted. So this is Jonathan's report. This report was done on 3 August 1950. His chart was charted on 3 August 1950. And you're going to see all some of his documents in here. His medical records are also in September 1954. UN forces received shipment number 17, roster 6-2, which included a set of remains marked as unknown, labeled 1900, that were reportedly recovered from an isolated grave with a reported grid coordinate, and they list the grid coordinate. The set of remains were designated in the letter N to it. For American Graves Registration Services tracking, 1900 became N14-1900. And upon determination, once it was determined that they were unknown remains, it changed to an X. The X stood for unknown. And again, you'll see the initial processing at the Central Identification Unit in Kokura, where the scientists determined that it was a report was forwarded to the Quartermaster General in Washington, D.C. And they were approved by the Quartermaster General in Washington, D.C. on the 26th of October, 1955. On the next page, at the bottom of the page,
Am I going too far?
you're going to see remains.
Right here.
Yeah. At the bottom of the page, those are the names of the 5 Marines, the unresolved U.S. Marine casualties. Yeah, and they were in the area that the remains were recovered, that were turned over to the United Nations. They were in the area that the Chinese, one of them were excluded right away, and that was Valenzuela. I'm in touch with his family. I know his family very well. Because the scientists determined that they were the remains of a Caucasian, Valenzuela. We often keep the families informed on what the government is doing in their cases. So.
Well, they go to a large extent to be sure they're right, don't they?
Oh yes, oh yes.
Because I was told by somebody they thought this whole thing was a fraud.
Oh, I know.
So
I'm glad to hear this because
the 3 dates that are listed as December 2nd, those 3 guys, including Johnny, were all killed at the same time in the same location?
No, as you can see, 2 of the guys were 1950. And so far, they've exhumed, and to date, I don't know how many sets of remains have been exhumed out of the punch bowl, but the first 11 sets of remains that were exhumed out of the punch bowl and examined, the first 6 were Marines.
I was just curious if the Tricks and the Perrys, their loved ones' remains are being buried also at this time.
Well, no, they haven't identified them yet.
Oh, they have not identified.
They have not identified them yet. Like I said, when they exhumed the remains, they believe the remains could be any, the casualties could be any of these 5 unresolved Marines. But when, at the end of the analysis, they turn out to be Johnny. So these guys have not been recovered in ID. They still may be buried, they still unknown. They still may be buried in the punch bowl. It's believed that they were buried in the punch bowl. Now, we have some Marines that fought in that area, never made it up there. They're still in North Korea.
But just because the date is the same does not mean they were fighting side by side with Johnny.
Oh, no, no. And you'll see that, the units. And you'll see that. PFC Valenzuela was immediately taken out of the group because the scientists would have been able to determine that he was of Hispanic descent when they looked at the layout of the skeletal remains. His records indicate that he was Caucasian, but and that's not unusual for people to put in their records, you know, when I've seen stuff on records says race other. You know, what other means, you know, you got to put a race there. You got to be some race. But long time ago, during Vietnam, you would see people put other. And, you know, that's a problem. We had a Marine, Colin said that Hattie, I know this is Hammond, Staff Sergeant Hammond, Dennis Hammond. He says, but I have a problem here. He said his records indicate Caucasian, which is not unusual, but I'm looking at the remains and they strong characteristics of Native American, which means he's almost full-blooded. And he said, and I'm almost positive this is him. He said, can you call the family in Texas and ask them what's his nationality? And he said, also looking at the remains, I see that before he came in the Marine Corps, he has a and the remains that were recovered, if you look at the chart, the first column says unknown, that were exhumed from the punch bowl. And then you'll see each of the Marines' names. This is what their dental charts indicated. Mm-hmm. Look at his dental chart and compare them to the remains over on the opposite side. For instance, you'll see the E equals indicates that the tooth was there and it had been unrestored, which means that he had nothing. The dentist said Jonathan almost had perfect teeth, actually. Yeah.
He had a good smile.
He had a good smile, but he didn't have he didn't have a lot of cavities and stuff. You know, like I have an 8-year-old granddaughter. She opens her mouth. She's got all silver at the bottom, caps, because they capped all her teeth because she eats so much candy.
She loved her sweets.
That's my daughter. So for 8 years old, if she opened her mouth, you know, it's just all silver caps on all of her bottom teeth. So, and if you look on the next page. Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay.
And you look on
page 4.
The next page. You'll see X's for antemortem missing on Kederick and name, parents' names, and his parents' place of birth, Mexico. It is likely that he was of Hispanic ethnicity. And after speaking with his sister, he was Spanish. So.
See, you guys, what's going on? They know who you are.
And one of the good. Oh, one of the other good things you'll see is each associated individual, the 5 individuals that they associated the remains with, you'll see the write-up of each individual, what unit they were in, Doug, and you just asked me that. You'll see they started with Galvin, the first guy, and on each page you can actually read about, what unit the person was in and what happened to that specific person where the unit was fighting. And you be careful because you're going to see those remains. And I mean, you can look at them. And we can take a break. Families do look at them, and I'll take a break.
Okay, because I don't want to go there.
I get emotional too. Just take your time. It's emotional for me too.
When you feel ready, or if you don't.
Yeah, even after doing over 100 of these, I'm still not.
The next page shows the.
The next.
Yeah, this is where.
Yeah, the next page, and I'm going to get to that. The next page shows a map of the Udomni Cemetery in Turkey Hill, where the guys were, the Chosin Reservoir region, showing approximate incident locations for the unresolved casualties associated with the X-14900. And as you can see, the 5 guys, this is the location that they were, historians indicated that they were in at the Chosin Reservoir. And you'll see the remains that according to the Chinese, the remains to them that were designated as X-14900, you'll see that all the guys were close by in this area. As a matter of fact, the remains were located somewhere right in here, according to the Chinese.
I wonder what that question mark's for.
Perry,
it doesn't matter.
One of the question marks is a question mark if Perry was actually in that area, or if that's actually the exact area the Chinese got the remains from. Okay. Sometimes they'll point out that, for instance, they had remains turned over to them before, where the Koreans said that the remains came from this area. But when they look at the area, and we had no movie for the Marines.
Clint Eastwood.
The young guy. South of the reported recovery location of X-14900. And approximately 600 million Italians present at Udomni. Elements of the 1st, 3rd, and the 4th battalions were...
He was in that 4th battalion, if I remember correctly.
Exactly.
But he was assigned to the 7th Marine Regiment.
Yeah, provision. Yeah, at the time of his death. And as you can see again, he was killed on 2 December while serving provisionally as an infantryman with the 7th Marine Regiment. And again, you'll see one of the witnesses reported saying PFC Posey instantly killed by a burst of automatic fire received in the right chest and shoulder.
There's a soldier that did the identification identified.
Bogoso.
I just saw him last weekend.
I
He was
think
in a big meeting.
somehow or other that's cropping up in my mind.
Yeah, he's a big guy involved in this. I just saw him.
Maybe one of the letters I got was signed by him or something. I don't know. It's just
Yeah. And on the next page again, you'll see where it says age statute provided in the unknown file. And the final reductions based on the biological profiles of general comparisons resulted in the association of these 5 guys. And that's why how they were able to narrow it down to these five guys. Oh, it's
I mean, I don't see how you could deny it.
we've never had any denied, but we're going to go over that too because you do get that option. We've never, but you do get the option because
I remember when Pelican, when somebody came to visit, that reported that they saw Johnny killed.
Who was this?
I don't know. Do you remember?
They may have a name. It's further in the back. You'll see. I don't know if they ever listed a name, but I can tell you this. When I get back, if not in this book, in Johnny's records, we have all of his records back at the office. We have his IDPF, which is called the Individual Deceased Personnel
Did they take a
File.
picture of him when he went into the Corps? I was thinking they probably did.
We don't have a picture.
You know,
of
when
him.
they do
That's
give
why
them
we
the burr
requested-
cut and
Yeah. Some of them we do have pictures of them. Others we do not. Most of the Korean War we did have a photograph of. Some of them we did not. And obviously we didn't have one of Johnny because I think. Okay. So-
Y'all just excuse me.
Okay.
A
And,
minute.
you might. Okay. So you're gonna be okay.
Yeah.